Hello, welcome back to Math Time with Professor Prime, and I am your host as always, Professor Prime. And today we're going to talk about math in Final Fantasy VII. So, I've talked about Final Fantasy games in some of my videos before, right? And this is the first one where I want to go more in depth. Now, I could have chosen really any of the Final Fantasy games, but I wanted to choose Final Fantasy VII because I feel like you can kind of divide out the Final Fantasy games, or the main ones, into like three eras, so to speak. You know, the earlier games, the mid games, and current modern games. And I feel like at the end of the day, when it comes to Final Fantasy, you know, you get different gameplay elements in each game and different like battle mechanics and all that. But at the core, or at its core, each of the games are getting at very similar themes, and they have the same major gameplay elements. And with Final Fantasy VII, I think it's particularly interesting because it is pretty close to the earlier games like 1 2, 6, but it is the first 3D game. And that's fascinating to me. So I feel like there's a lot to talk about it, and it is arguably the most successful Final Fantasy game. And it's certainly the one with the most components. It is a sub-series of Final Fantasy within itself, and you have what they call the compilation of Final Fantasy VII. And, you know, we can get into that a little bit, but so yeah, what I want to do with this video is I want to talk about Final Fantasy VII. I want to talk about how math is used in its world, how it's used in its gameplay primarily, and how it's used on a more meta level. And in another video, I want to tackle Final Fantasy VII Remake because I feel like there's a lot to say with that. So I think it's all pretty interesting, and you can assume that there are going to be spoilers ahead. Assume lots of spoilers. All right. So with Final Fantasy VII, like I said, it is like a lot of the earlier games, and I feel like that's good. And like for the mid tier of games, or sorry, midpoint of games, like for that middle era of Final Fantasy games, like, so I think of that as like kind of like 10 to 13. So I feel like that covers a lot. And with those games, they still took a lot of you know, the basics for Final Fantasy, and they tried a lot of different things within it. And 10 and 13 have sequels. 10 was the first to have a sequel, but 13 does too, and then like, you know, 7 as well. And we'll get into 7 a bit more. But I don't want to ramble too much with that. So yeah, let's just jump right into it. So with Final Fantasy VII, it's got a sci-fi setting. There's already like a lot of math within the world and how things function, right? Like, and I feel like much like we'd have in our real world, there's math everywhere, and there's something to be said about that. But I want to focus now on the gameplay. So you have your world map, you have your field screen, and you have your battle screen. And with your world map, there are representations of each village and area, and there's a lot of math and the scaling involved with that, right? And I think, you know, there's something to be said about that. There's a lot of geometry going on, a lot of different craziness as far as math is concerned. And then there's the field screen, so you know, you could be like in a village or just some area, and you're going about, and you'll see different things there. You'll see different people, and there's math and how all of that is situated. And then as far as the battle is concerned, like the battle screen and the battle system in general, there's a lot of math that goes into that. Like with your characters, they all have their stats. You know, they all have their like base stats that like will increase with gained experience, and there's a lot of math in gaining that experience and how it's all displayed, because when you look at the stats, right, they're numerical in nature, and when you look at damage taken and damage dealt, it's quantified. And when you look at the stats, sorry, when you look at the stats, you know, you have things like attack, defense, magical defense, vitality, and evasion, luck, all that good stuff. Spirit, in this case, I don't know, it's been a while. I was gonna say like spirit maybe instead of magic. It's been a while, but the idea is like there's different stats that indicate different things, and they're given numerical values, and these increase as your levels go up, which the levels are quantifiable too, and they also increase with different weapons and equipment, and there's also status like ailments to consider. There's like status changes that you could impose on your opponent, but there's also status changes that could be imposed on you. And there's math that goes into all that and like what they do. Like with paralysis, you're not going to be able to really move if you're stunned like that. With poison, your health is going to go down. And then there's things like zombie and all this other stuff, and like mini. And then there's toad. There's like sleep, and they all have these different effects, but math is involved in all of it. Then there's the material system, right? Like, so you have your weapons and you have your equipment, and they have a limited amount of slots. So you have to be strategic with those slots. And throughout the game, right, you get different materia, and these materia do different things. They give different effects. They can amp up your stats. They allow you to do different commands sometimes. And so you have to be strategic when you're looking at how many slots you have for your equipment and your weapon, and what those weapons do too. So there's a lot of math going on, even if you're not writing it out. And I know personally, by the time I get to the end of Final Fantasy VII, I like to really make sure my characters are just like crazy. They're ready to go ham at any point, right? And there's also like summon material to consider too. And in any case, I like using different magic, different damaging spells, different healing spells, and all that good stuff. But I also like to have my characters have 2x cut and preemptive strike. And what's interesting about the material here is like the material will grow when you accrue AP, like when you have it equipped. And you accrue enough AP, you eventually master the materia. And with certain materia, they will spawn a new version of that materia. And in some cases, they will change command. So there's a lot of math that's going into building up that AP and getting more materia and transforming said materia. So I mentioned 2x cut. One of the coolest things is like if I master that 2x cut, along the way of mastering it, I am going to get that 2x cut to become a 4x cut, which is awesome. And then, I'll be able to kind of give birth to a 2x cut by the time it's mastered, right? And that's really cool. And then I can get that and use that with more characters, because as far as I could tell, you get like one 2x cut if you find it, and then you can master that to get more for your party. And I really like it because it's like, not only am I doing, my usual damage, but I'm doing it 4 times. So I like to have my 2x cut so I can eventually make that a 4x cut and eventually give that to other players too. Or, give a 2x cut to the other players and max it out to be 4x cut and keep that going until I'm satisfied. And it's like, it's very useful because, right, I get to attack 4 times without penalty. And that's awesome. And if I've maxed out my characters in terms of, their strength stat, I'm dealing 9,999 damage to my opponent. And I'm doing that 4 times. So at the end of the day, it ends up being about 40,000 damage with 1 turn if I play my cards right. And that's awesome. There's a lot of math that goes into developing these systems. And there's a lot of customization with that materia system, right? And I think it's all cool because you can choose your weapons, you can choose your materia, and then that's not all. Like Final Fantasy VII has a very in-depth, battle system, and one of the big parts that you'll see in one form or another that comes into Final Fantasy games are the idea of limit breaks. They might be known by a different name in certain games, but the idea is like if you take enough damage, you can fill your limit gauge and you can unleash different attacks. Now, if you're like a healer, like Earth, maybe you can do a big healing move. But for a lot of characters, it's more damage. And so I think that's awesome. And if you play your cards right, you can, be strategic and build up your limit break without dying. You can use certain items, certain abilities, and just play around with it. And for me, I like having my heavy hitters go all out. Like I do exchange team members here and there throughout the game. But I think my favorite team is kind of classic. It's like Cloud, Tifa, and Barrett. And having them all maxed out, having them have all their final limit breaks, and just going in is crazy. And Omni Slash, oh my God, Omni Slash, so much damage. But yeah, so what's also interesting is like as you're going through battle, like and you're using your limit breaks a certain amount of times, or under certain conditions, it'll allow you to unlock more limit breaks. And each character has a fourth limit break that you can find, or you have to do something special to get. And if you do that, you're gonna unleash the damage, you're gonna unleash the pain. If you play your cards right, you're just a damage dealing machine. So by the time I am towards the end of any Final Fantasy VII playthrough, my characters are absolute beasts. They're all probably over leveled, all OP. They all have like material that I feel works with them. They all have like 4x cut, and I have like preemptive strike on them. And I'm mixing and I'm matching. And of course, I have their summons, so if they need to go there, they need to go there. But really, because of the way I set things up when I play, they don't really need the summons. Most of the summons aren't going to be able to dish out as much damage as the characters are going to be able to do when I'm done with them. But Knights of the Round being one of the exceptions. And you have to do a lot with that. Which reminds me, it's like when you're going for like the Golden Chocobo, you have to do like a lot of different activities. You got to decide, is that worth your time? Is that worth your energy? Is that worth your effort? And there's a lot of math that goes into all of that. And it's pretty interesting. And there are like super bosses that you can fight as in any Final Fantasy game. But I do feel like the super bosses in Final Fantasy VII are probably the most well known. And I gotta say, like the two that stick out. Well, okay, no, I'll go with all three. But the two that are actually tough are Emerald and Ruby. But you could also fight Ultima Weapon to get. Sorry, you can fight the ultimate weapon to get Ultima. I'm probably mixing it up, but anyway, there's a weapon called Ultima, and you can get that and like or use it for Cloud, and that helps with the damage output too. But there's a caveat being like if Cloud is lower on health, the damage output decreases, so you got to be careful and be mindful with that. But anyway, fighting like the ultimate weapon, I think it's not necessarily easy, but it's not that difficult too. You could do it pretty solidly, pretty reasonably in your playthrough. And then you have Emerald and you have Ruby weapon, and they're different. Now with Emerald, you can get an item and that like allows you to breathe underwater to face it, and you got to decide if that's worth it to you to put in the time and energy and effort to do that. But you could also brute force it if your characters are just like crazy powerful and you're crazy careful during the battle. But you have a 20-minute time limit to fight Emerald. Now I've done it. I've beaten Emerald within that time limit. But just to be clear, there was not much time to spare. And like Emerald has like a lot of health. I think it's like 1 million, but you can check that. But anyway, it can take a lot of damage. It can take a lot of damage, and because I don't know, I'm not sure with Emerald, so they could take a lot of damage. It could take a lot of damage. You're picking this case, but yeah. So there's a lot of math that goes into fighting a monster like that, and then like for Ruby, you pretty much have to do a certain strategy. Like there's several strategies that you could use, but they're the kind where you'd be hard pressed to stumble across them while you're just playing. Like you probably have to look them up. But hey, if you're someone who did play Ruby and you beat Ruby of your own accord and you figure out a way that works, awesome. And there's just like a lot of math that goes into it, a lot of very specific things. That being said, that's a lot about the gameplay. But there's a lot of math with the story and how it unfolds and how it all comes together. There's a lot of math behind the scenes and like how it was made, how it was produced. There's a lot of math when it comes to like translating it. And honestly, with Final Fantasy VII, I don't think it was done super well. Like it's competent enough that you get the story, and I think that is the most important part. But there were some errors, and while some of them were harmless, there were some that were harmful because part of the story gets kind of misconstrued with like who's in charge, Genova or Sephiroth. And now that's a problem because that's been confusing for a lot of fans over here in the West. It's been confusing for years for a lot of people. So I think there's something to be said about that. But there's a lot of math that goes into translating, and that's interesting within itself. And then when you look at Final Fantasy VII and how it is in this series, like I said, I think it is the best selling one, and you can double check. Um, but it's, I think, one of the most popular, if not the most popular, Final Fantasy game. And it's gotten to the point where it has its own sub-series, the compilation of Final Fantasy VII. And there's a lot of money that goes into all that. And so, you got movies, you got different games, and you also have like a lot of merchandise that goes in with all of it. And it's kind of crazy. Side note, Advent Children is something that I liked, and there was a lot of math that went into making that. And honestly, most of it still holds up to this day, despite it coming out in like 2005. And I enjoyed what they did with the music because there's a lot of math that goes into music. There was a lot of math that went into the music in the game Final Fantasy VII. It was well composed, and it's like, well, you're constructing it so you can play that on a loop if need be for certain situations. And like a lot of the music from there just hits and hits hard. And while a lot of people might say, One Wing Angel is their favorite song from there, and it is honestly an amazing song, like one of the best. I actually prefer Genova, and I liked the mix that they had in Advent Children. And if I can think about it, I can put some music down there in the description if you're watching this on YouTube. Because I seen playlists for it, and I could find the playlist for Final Fantasy VII music, but I also want to put something like about the Genova remix in there. In any case, there's a lot of math that went to Final Fantasy VII, and there's a lot of math that's still going into it in terms of the larger picture. Because in 2020, Final Fantasy VII remake came out. People have been clamoring at the bit for a Final Fantasy VII remake for a long, long time. I remember back when PS3 came out, they did this tech demo, and it was just really briefly the opening for Final Fantasy VII. And since then, people have not been able to let the idea go. And they finally did do a remake in 2020, but it's not quite what you think. But I'll talk about that in a separate video because it is a remake, but it's a little bit more than that. It is the latest installment in the compilation of Final Fantasy VII, and it's just it's crazy how much math there is in Final Fantasy in general, but in Final Fantasy VII and everything that comes along with it. And for the record, there's a lot of math in gaming in general, and there's a lot of math in RPGs, especially JRPGs. It's just insane. That being said, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I will probably be coming out with a Final Fantasy VII Remake one in the very, very near future because I feel like there's a lot to be said with it and a lot of potential. That being said, Final Fantasy VII is one of my favorite games, period, and one of my favorite Final Fantasy games as well. In terms of favorite, I say one of the favorites because Final Fantasy VI is really high up there for me. And honestly, after playing 9 earlier this year, that got up there pretty high. So yeah, it is absolutely up there for me. And I think somehow it's overrated and yet underrated at the same time, if that makes any sense. Either way, it's a very pivotal game, very important. First 3D Final Fantasy game, and look at what it's become. It is still going strong. It is over 20 years at this point. But yeah, I'll see you on the next one. Professor Prime out.